There's been a lot of cruelty over the last 5 days in the name of news, in the name of, let's put it bluntly, in the name of entertainment. And even on my channel, there's been a scurrying desperation to speculate and identify the person who was at the center of this media storm, whipped up by the sun. And for the first time, I've done something that I've resisted in the past, and I've removed people's comments. Maybe not in time, but certainly as soon as I could. And my immediate instinct, the only way to get rid of comments on YouTube and to see what's coming up, what people are writing now, is either to put a thumbs down or to put a thumbs up. And I must say I'm very reluctant to put a thumbs down because it gives the wrong impression. I want to stimulate debate, and there's very few times when I would actually want to say something is wrong. There may be something I don't agree with, but essentially I'm very pleased that that anything has been said at all. Yes, I may have thumbed up initially things which I shouldn't have done, but I have learned, and I have now discovered how to erase those messages. I don't think I would do it in future, or I would do it very carefully, but it requires so much time and it's exhausting. But I think necessary. The speculation was wrong and was drummed up by a very malicious media. And I think one should have compassion for the victims and for people accused. And I think there's a big difference between criminality and failing trust. And the second one, I think, is still a relevant question. Hugh Edwards broke that relationship of trust with the people. And that is one reason why this story has been driven to the point of insanity. Because people have seen somebody who they admired, and they have realized that he has feet of clay. And of course, the vigor of the Sun's drip, drip, drip story is captivating. The Sun and the BBC have almost been in a standoff over the last few days, and the BBC has not been without its own drip, drip, drip of return storytelling. And when we put this in perspective, the cost of living crisis, the increasing failure of Brexit, the mortgage crisis, political corruption, Boris, the NATO summit, and Wallace's attempt to pose as a major statesman, undermining himself with flippant comments about behaving like an Amazon store. Well, he demonstrates very clearly why he is not a major statesman and why he will not be the leader of NATO. He demonstrates that with his quip. And the other thing about the story is that it gives a sort of icon, an image to the drive to destroy the BBC and get rid of its license fee. This is something that has been a pet project of many people in the far right of the Conservative Party, and particularly people like Nadine Dorries. And to see the underbelly of the BBC, as we have seen over the last 5 days, is not an attractive sight. But we have to have perspective, and we have to recognize that this was also partly a distraction from other issues. What has driven this story is failure, profit, and problems. And the Sun says that in its defense, it was driven by concerns for the parents of the child who had used money paid by Hugh Edwards to fund a drug habit. The parents did the right thing, absolutely, in going first to the police and then to the BBC to try. They actually walked into a BBC centre, apparently, to try and get their child off drugs. It's what any parent would try and do, I think. And I don't know whether that's failed or not failed, because it's extraordinary. In the lengthy statement by Vicky Flint, Hugh Edwards' wife, there is no mention at all of the victims, no mention of the initial child, no mention of the other people who have come forward, no mention of the furious telephone calls allegedly by Hugh Edwards to these people. How could you do this? Why did you do it? And do you not know who I am? And that sort of bluster. And it must be terribly intimidating to have one of those telephone calls. And equally, the timing of the statement yesterday, just before the 6 o'clock news, maybe it was to scupper even worse revelations by the Sun, but the Sun has now agreed to button its lips and to pursue no further, to allow the BBC to do its own investigation. And that's probably a relief. And equally, Jeremy Vine, I'm sure, will suspend his references and his comments. And I'm sure they themselves were delivered for the very best of reasons. But Jeremy Vine is also a victim. Why was he not mentioned in this statement? The people who have suffered because of Hugh Edwards' foolishness, he's left a swathe of wreckage behind him, including, I suspect, his own career. And my hunch is that the BBC will find a tidy way of him leaving with some dignity, but I think he will not be fronting the news again. And there may be some form of rehabilitation, media rehabilitation in a few years' time, but his position as the chief anchor of the BBC, the face of the BBC, is now gone. And the BBC will be looking for a new face. I think they're wrong. I don't think we need a face of the news. I think what we need is the debate about the news. What we need is something which is closer to the Channel 4 approach, far closer to the Channel 4 approach than to the nonsense peddled by GB News and Talk TV. We need a thoughtful, analytic newscast. In the same way that Vicky Flynn's statement was issued in two forms, the short version and the longer version. That's actually what we need on the BBC. We need something on mainstream BBC television media which approximates to the Today programme. I think that's perfectly reasonable. We need something on mainstream BBC television which approximates to Women's Hour. I think that's reasonable as well. And we don't have either. What we have is a television station drenched with quiz shows and reality TV and repeats and weather, constant references to the weather. We need to rethink what we're doing. But the fight between the BBC and the Sun, and it really was a battle, is probably now over, and the BBC probably can think that it won, and that was almost inevitable. One of them had to blink, and the Sun blinked first, and the Sun has now capitulated. And whether the parents can move forward, whether the parents can get further help for their child, whether those people who were wrongly accused can get support. I hope they can. And equally, Hugh Edwards in hospital, whether he was there voluntarily or because he was sectioned, again, one hopes he gets the help he needs, because it's horrible being at the centre of a news storm. And I don't wish that on anybody. And the conclusion to this story is very different in many ways to the conclusion of the Philip Schofield story, partly because of the mental health issue and because Hugh Edwards has demonstrably talked about depression in the past. And this is a credible and a terribly sad story. And if we're going to take mental health seriously, we have to take this seriously. And I think we should. But at the same time, we should be reaching out to support those people who were caught up in the wreckage. And I trust the BBC will be reaching out and not just investigating, that they will be actively supporting those people who have been hurt, because that's the right thing to do.